The music stopped, not because the song ended, not because the equipment failed, because Tupac Shakur, mid-verse, sweat still flying off him, 3,000 people hanging on every word, suddenly went completely still. He was staring at someone in the crowd. Nobody around that person had noticed him yet. He looked like everyone else. Same clothes, same age. He was holding a drink he hadn't touched in 40 minutes. But Tupac had been watching him for 2 songs, and something about the way this man stood, the way he didn't move when the bass hit, the way his eyes never closed, the way he was building something in his head rather than losing himself in the music, had sent a signal through Tupac's body that overrode everything else. He had grown up learning to read that signal. His mother had taught him, the Panthers had taught her, and the signal was screaming. Tupac lowered the microphone. He raised his arm. He pointed, and in the next 4 minutes, in front of 3,000 witnesses at the Palladium in New York City on November 28, 1994, 2 days before he would be shot 5 times, 30 days before he would be convicted and sent to prison, Tupac Shakur said out loud the thing that the United States government had spent years and millions of dollars trying to make sure nobody ever said out loud. The federal agent standing in that crowd had a file on Tupac that was older than his career. Tupac had just told everyone in that room it existed, and nothing that happened after that, the shooting, the conviction, the prison, none of it could put that back in the dark. To understand what Tupac saw that night, you have to understand what 1994 had already cost him. He was 23 years old, and he had spent the entire year being consumed. Not by fame. He had learned to manage fame, had learned to use it the way his mother Afeni had taught him to use every tool available, as a weapon against the people who wanted him silent. What was consuming him in 1994 was something more systematic than fame and more dangerous than celebrity. It was the machinery of the state turning its full attention toward him, and Tupac could feel it the way you feel eyes on the back of your neck in a dark hallway. But first, before we get to the moment of pointing, before we get to the arm extended over 3,000 people and the man standing frozen near the back wall, you need to understand the specific texture of Tupac Shakur's life in the weeks leading up to November 28, 1994. Because what happened at the Palladium that night did not come out of nowhere. It came out of something that had been building for months, a pressure that had been applied from so many directions simultaneously that by the time he walked onto that stage, Tupac was not performing for an audience. He was performing for his survival. The sexual assault trial was 11 days from its verdict. He had been living inside that case for over a year. The depositions, the hearings, the pretrial motions, the media coverage that had taken a complex situation and flattened it into a narrative that served the people who wanted him discredited. His legal team was working with limited resources while the prosecution had the full weight of the Manhattan District Attorney's Office behind them. He knew what a conviction meant, not just prison, the systematic erasure of credibility that conviction carries, the way everything he had ever said and every song he had ever made would be reread through the lens of what the jury decided. He had also, in the previous 3 months, received information that confirmed what his upbringing had taught him to suspect, that the legal case was not separate from the surveillance, not separate from the monitoring, not a coincidence that had arrived independent of everything else. The timing, the specific charges, the way certain evidence had been handled, people he trusted, people with knowledge of how these systems operated, had been telling him that what was happening to him was coordinated, not in a paranoid, unfounded way. In the specific, documented, historically precedented way that the American government had operated against black political voices for decades. He had grown up knowing what that machinery looked like. Afeni Shakur had been arrested in 1969, 8 months pregnant with Tupac, and charged with conspiracy to bomb public buildings across New York City. The FBI had a file on her that was older than Tupac himself. He had been raised on the stories of COINTELPRO, the FBI's counterintelligence program that had infiltrated, sabotaged, and destroyed the Black Panther Party from the inside using informants, planted evidence, and coordinated harassment from law enforcement at every level. He knew the names. Fred Hampton, murdered in his bed at 21 by Chicago police acting on FBI intelligence. Mark Clark, Geronimo Pratt, framed for a murder the FBI knew he didn't commit, imprisoned for 27 years. He knew these names the way other children knew nursery rhymes. They were the bedtime stories of his childhood. So when his career exploded and the government started paying attention, Tupac did not have the luxury of surprise. He had been waiting for it. What he had not fully calculated was the speed of it. By November 1994, he had released 2 albums. He had starred in 3 films. He had built a following that cut across every demographic divide in American music, black and white, coasts and middle America. Teenagers in suburbs who had never been anywhere near what he was describing, and teenagers in the streets he was describing, who heard their own lives in his words for the first time. He had also been arrested twice that year. Once for allegedly shooting 2 off-duty Atlanta police officers who witnesses said were harassing a black motorist, charges that were eventually dropped, and once for the sexual assault case in New York that was now moving toward trial. He had been shot at. He had been followed. His phone had been behaving in ways that people who knew about such things recognized as monitored. And 2 nights before the Palladium show, someone in his circle had told him something that changed how he read every room he walked into. The hip-hop cops were real. Not a rumor, not a conspiracy theory, real. A unit within the NYPD that operated with FBI coordination specifically tasked with surveilling rappers, their associates, and their concert venues, plainclothes officers embedded in crowds, informants inside record labels, agents who looked exactly like fans, dressed exactly like fans, who stood in venues and documented everything they saw. The unit had files on dozens of artists. Tupac's file, the person told him, was one of the thickest. He had sat with that information for 2 days. He had not slept well. He had gone to the Palladium that night carrying it, the way you carry something heavy that you can't put down. The Palladium on 14th Street was one of the great New York concert venues of the early 1990s. A converted nightclub that held around 3,000 people and had a sound system that made the walls sweat. The crowd that night was dense and electric, the kind of New York hip-hop audience that had seen everything and was still capable of being moved, still capable of bringing an energy to a room that was unlike anything that happened anywhere else on earth. Tupac fed off that energy. He had always been a performer who became more himself on stage than anywhere else, who found in the connection with a live crowd something that he couldn't access in a studio or an interview or a conversation. On stage, there was no performance. On stage was the only place he was entirely real. He had been performing for about 45 minutes. He had opened with the aggression, the songs that hit like a fist, that made the floor shake and the people in the front rows press backward from the sheer physical force of the sound. The crowd was with him completely. 3,000 people in total surrendered to what was happening on that stage. Then, during a brief instrumental break, he looked out at the crowd, and he saw the man. He was standing about 15 rows back, slightly left of center, maybe 30 years old. He was wearing clothes that were right. The right brands, the right fit, the right era, but wearing them the way someone wears a costume rather than the way someone wears their own clothes. There was a quality to his stillness that was wrong for the room. Everyone else in that building was moving, not necessarily dancing, but moving the way bodies move when music is running through them. This man was not moving. He was watching with a specific, professional quality of attention that Tupac recognized because he had seen it before, had been on the receiving end of it in courtrooms and police stations and in the back seats of cars while being transported to arraignments. It was the attention of someone who was building a file. Tupac kept performing. He did not break his rhythm, did not let anything show in his face or his body. He was 23 years old, and he had been raised by a Black Panther, and he understood that the moment you let someone know you've identified them is the moment you lose the advantage you just gained. So he kept performing. He worked through 2 more songs. He felt the crowd, felt the room, felt the 3,000 people who had paid to be there and had no idea what was happening at the edge of Tupac's awareness. And then, because he was who he was, because silence in the face of the thing that was trying to erase him had never once been an option, he stopped the music. The band didn't understand at first. They kept playing for a few bars before the confusion spread from person to person and the sound died. 3,000 people felt the shift and went quiet in that instinctive way crowds go quiet when something real is happening that wasn't in the program. Tupac stood at the microphone for a moment without speaking. He was looking at the man, The man was still not moving, still watching, still building his file. "I want to talk to y'all about something," Tupac said. His voice was quiet. Not the performance voice, the real one. The one that came out when he was thinking out loud, working something through in real time. "I want to talk to y'all about what it means to be watched." The crowd stirred. A few people called out. Most just listened. "My mother was a Black Panther," Tupac said. "Y'all know that. She was arrested when she was pregnant with me. She was in the women's house of detention when she was 8 months pregnant because the FBI had decided she was dangerous. She wasn't dangerous. She was a 20-something-year-old woman who believed in the liberation of her people, and the government decided that belief was a threat." He paused. They had an informant inside the Panthers. His name was George Coles. He was one of them. He looked like one of them, talked like one of them, believed what they believed as far as anyone could tell. But he was working for the government, and because of what he told them, my mother went to jail while she was pregnant with me. The room was completely still. That program, COINTELPRO, they said it ended in 1971. They said it was over. They held hearings. They released documents. They said never again. He looked out at the crowd, not at the man yet, at the crowd. But the program never ended. It just changed its name. It just changed its clothes. It just learned to dress better. And now he raised his arm and pointed. "There's a man standing in this building tonight," Tupac said, his finger extended, aimed directly at the man 15 rows back, "who is not here for the music." The reaction in the crowd was immediate and chaotic. People turned. People stepped back. People tried to see who he was pointing at. The man, trained, professional, prepared for almost anything, held still for 1 beat, 2 beats, 3 beats, the way you hold still when you're calculating your options. Then he started moving toward the exit. "Don't leave," Tupac said into the microphone. Not aggressive, almost calm. "I'm not angry at you. I want to talk to you." The man kept moving. "Stop him," someone in the crowd called out. Several people moved to block the aisle. Security was confused, unsure whose side they were on in a situation that had no protocol. The man stopped. Not because the crowd stopped him, though they had, but because something in Tupac's voice had landed differently than he expected. Not threatening, not performing, just direct. The voice of someone who had something to say to him specifically. Tupac looked at him across 3,000 people. "I know what you're doing here," Tupac said. "You're here because someone decided I was dangerous. Same thing they decided about my mother. Same thing they decided about Fred Hampton. Same thing they decided about every black man in this country who stood up and said the truth out loud." He let that settle. "You're building a file. You're documenting. You're going to write up what you saw tonight and put it in a folder with my name on it, and that folder is going to be used to put me away." He paused. "That file already exists, doesn't it?" It wasn't a question. The man didn't answer. "I need you to understand something," Tupac said, and his voice dropped even lower, the way it dropped when he was speaking from the deepest part of himself, the part that his music came from. "I am not Fred Hampton. I am not going to be shot in my bed while I sleep. I am not going to disappear, and the reason I am not going to disappear is standing in this room right now. 3,000 people heard what I just said. 3,000 people now know that you exist, that your program exists, that the surveillance of black artists in this country exists. You can't put that back in the folder." What happened in the next 20 minutes was the part that the people who were in that room never forgot for the rest of their lives. Tupac did not finish the concert the way he had planned it. He put down the set list. He stood at the microphone, and he taught. He talked about COINTELPRO with the detail and the specificity of someone who had been studying it his entire life, because he had. He named the programs, the informants, the operations. He talked about how the FBI had sent Martin Luther King a letter in 1964 urging him to commit suicide. He talked about how they had planted informants in the Black Panther Party who helped orchestrate the assassination of Fred Hampton. He talked about how the same tactics, infiltration, surveillance, manufactured legal problems, the weaponization of the justice system had been updated and applied to hip-hop in the 1990s because hip-hop had become what the Panthers had been in the 1960s, the political voice of a generation the government was afraid of. He talked about his own case, the sexual assault charges that were moving toward trial. He did not claim innocence in the terms a lawyer would use, careful, hedged, designed for a courtroom. He talked about the specific way the system worked, the way legal pressure was used to silence people who couldn't be silenced any other way. "They can't stop me from talking," he said, "so they find something else. They find a charge, they find a case, and suddenly I'm not a political voice anymore, I'm a criminal. And everything I've ever said can be dismissed because I'm a criminal." He talked about his mother, about what it meant to have been born into a family the government had already decided was dangerous, to have inherited not just a name and a face but a target. He talked about the specific loneliness of knowing that the people around you might not all be who they said they were, that trust itself had been weaponized against people like him, that the price of being a public black political voice in America was the permanent possibility of betrayal from within. The crowd had gone from electric to something different, something more serious. The energy in the room was not the energy of a concert anymore. It was the energy of a church, or a trial, or one of those rare moments when a room full of strangers becomes a community because they are all hearing the same difficult truth at the same time. The man who had been pointed at was still in the building. He had not left. He was standing near the back wall, and people around him had given him space. Not in a threatening way, but in the way you give space to someone who has been named and is living with the weight of that naming. Tupac looked at him one more time. "I don't hate you," Tupac said. "I want to be clear about that. You're doing a job. Someone told you this job was about protecting people, and maybe you believe that. But I need you to go back to whoever sent you here and tell them something from me." He paused. "Tell them it didn't work. Tell them I'm not scared. Tell them that every person in this room tonight knows what their program looks like now. And tell them that the music they're trying to stop is going to outlast every file they ever built, every charge they ever manufactured, every cage they ever built for people who told the truth." He picked up the microphone stand. "We're going to finish this show now," he said. "Because that's what we do. We don't stop. We don't go quiet. We don't make it easy for them." The roar that came back from those 3,000 people was not the roar of fans responding to a performer. It was the roar of people who had just been told something true about the world they lived in, and who recognized that truth with their whole bodies. 2 days later, on November 30th, 1994, Tupac Shakur walked into Quad Recording Studios in Times Square at 11 o'clock at night to record a verse for a song he had been asked to do as a favor. In the lobby, 3 men were waiting. They robbed him and shot him 5 times. He was hit in the head, the groin, the thigh, and both hands. He survived by dragging himself into an elevator and making it to the studio on the floor above, where he collapsed. He was taken to Bellevue Hospital. He checked himself out 3 hours later, against medical advice, because his trial was beginning the next morning and he was not going to let them take that from him too. He showed up to the courthouse in a wheelchair, bandaged, still recovering from 5 bullet wounds. The jury convicted him on December 1st, 1994, of sexual abuse. He was sentenced in February 1995 to 1.5 to 4.5 years. He went to Rikers Island, then to Clinton Correctional Facility in Dannemora, a maximum security prison in upstate New York. The people who visited him there said he was different, reading constantly Machiavelli, Sun Tzu, the histories he had always known but now had time to sit inside, thinking, planning, getting sharper in the particular way that confinement sharpens certain kinds of minds, the ones that refuse to let the walls mean what walls are supposed to mean. The people who visited him there said he was different, reading constantly Machiavelli, Sun Tzu, the histories he had always known but now had time to sit inside, thinking, planning, getting sharper in the particular way that confinement sharpens certain kinds of minds, the ones that refuse to let the walls mean what walls are supposed to mean. He told visitors he had been right about everything, not with bitterness, with the specific clarity of someone whose predictions had come true and who was now deciding what to do with that clarity. He wrote music in prison, hundreds of verses in notebooks he filled with a focused intensity that stunned the guards who watched him work. He was 23, then 24 years old, and he was writing as though he understood that time was not on his side, Not in the casual way that young people speak about mortality, but in the earned, experienced way of someone who had already been shot 5 times and survived, who had already watched the system process him exactly as his mother had warned him it would, who was already building the architecture of what he would say when he got out. The album that came out of that period, Me Against the World, recorded before he went in, released while he was inside, went to #1 on the Billboard charts. A man in prison with 5 bullet wounds still healing in his body, with a conviction on his record and a sentence he was actively serving, had the #1 album in America. The system had put him in a cage and the music escaped anyway. That's what he had told the man at the Palladium it would do. The man from the Palladium. The one Tupac had pointed at. The one who had stood near the back wall for the rest of the night while 3,000 people listened to the truth being spoken. He filed his report the next morning. Standard surveillance documentation. Described the evening's events, the interruption to the concert, Tupac's statements, included the detail that his cover had been identified and compromised, noted that Tupac Shakur had directly addressed the crowd regarding federal surveillance programs and had named his own case as an example of the use of legal pressure against political figures. The report went into a folder. The folder went into a file. The file already existed, just as Tupac had said. But something else happened too, something that was not in any official report. The officer, his name has never been confirmed. The unit he worked for was not publicly acknowledged until years later, and the specific evening is known only from accounts of people who were present. That officer, somewhere between the Palladium and wherever he went next, made a choice about what the work he was doing actually was. Some of the people who were in that room that night became the people they became because of what they heard. One went to law school and spent her career working in criminal defense. One became a journalist who spent 20 years covering the intersection of law enforcement and black communities. One became a teacher in the Bronx who told his students about that night every year when he taught them about COINTELPRO, about the Panthers, about the long history of the government deciding that certain voices were too dangerous to be free. They all said the same thing when they talked about what happened after Tupac pointed at that man and said, "I see you." They said the air changed. They said it felt like something was being done for the first time that had always needed to be done. The naming of the invisible thing. The dragging of it into the light where 3,000 witnesses could see it. Tupac had known what was coming for him. He had known it the way his mother had known it, the way every black political voice of that era had known it, in the specific and well-founded way of people whose history has taught them that the system does not change its mind. It changes its methods. He pointed anyway. He said the thing anyway. He finished the concert anyway. 2 days later, they shot him. 30 days later, they convicted him. 4 months later, they sent him to a prison that bore the name of the president he had called out from that same stage. And the music they had been trying to stop since the moment they opened the first file with his name on it, the music never stopped. It is still playing. It will be playing when every file, every folder, every report filed by every man sent to stand in a crowd and watch and document, it will be playing when all of that is dust. That's what he told the man at the Palladium. That's what he told all of them. He was 23 years old and he was already out of time and he knew it and he pointed anyway.